In this edition of the UX Tea Break, I look at bias in user research. This particular question comes from Lynn. Lynn was on a training course that I ran this week in Edinburgh, and she asked a good question that I think is worthy of a wider audience. A question that she asked was this: how do you avoid bias in user research? Well, it's a great question because none of us want to do user research that's biased. We want to feel that we're as objective as possible. And I think there's an obvious answer to this question that I think you're probably familiar with already, and that's the idea that we need to do good experimental design. By experimental design, I mean that we need to make sure, for example, that our participants are relatively representative of our audience. If we're running a usability test, we want to make sure that our scenarios aren't biased. If we're doing field research, we want to make sure that the questions that we ask participants aren't leading, or we don't ask questions that we then provide an answer to before the participant has had an opportunity to answer. Well, most of those kind of things you can discover by reading textbooks on experimental design, and I'm sure you're familiar with them. But I think there are other areas of bias that I wanted to address here that people are less familiar with. The first area is to do with the inherent bias that you bring to a research situation. So whether you like it or not, you're biased. You've got certain people that you like in life and certain people that you don't like. Now, we've all got those biases. What we need to do is acknowledge that they're the case. For example, you might not like people that work in certain industries. You might not like people, people with beards. Maybe you love people with beards. The point is, you've got a different reaction to them depending on your own personal biases that you bring to the research situation. Now, you can't eradicate those biases. What you can be is aware of them. If you're aware of the bias that you have, that means that you can then go some way to address it in the situation. So one way we can avoid bias is being aware of our own biases and make sure that we address them. The second is to do with the participant. Sometimes I'll work with user researchers and they'll say, I just had a participant come into the session and I didn't learn anything from them. There was nothing new that I picked up. If that happens, I'd argue that's your problem, not the participant's problem. Participants have got something interesting to say. Our job as user researchers is to find out what that interesting thing is. What is it that they can tell us that we don't know already? If we're not finding out, then we're not asking the right kind of questions. And perhaps we're being stuck in our own biases. Or maybe, the participants are biased as well. They may not like our product or they may not like our company. And we need to make sure we can overcome that so we can hear from them and let them tell us the story that matters to them. Now, the third area of bias is to do with the development team itself. Harry Brignall, the user researcher, has a great quotation where he says, a user researcher that wants to please the design team is useless. And I think that applies importantly when we're thinking about bias, because nobody wants to be the bringer of bad news, do they? You don't want to say to your design team, everybody hates our product, nobody finds it useful, no one's got a need for it. But in many ways, that's our role. Nobody else in the organisation is going to do that, only us. We're the only people that say to the team, look, we need to be careful here, it's not doing particularly well. Now, I'm not saying that you only need to present bad news to the team, but in some ways, you do need to be a bit like the grit in the oyster. You need to make sure that they're aware of the problems with the current design, with the design concept that they have, that they're perhaps not addressing a user need, and make sure they're aware of that. The worst thing you can do is sweep that under the carpet because it's something that's going to come back to haunt you afterwards. So it's critical that even though, we want to make sure our design team are happy, and we need to get on with our design team by all means, at the same time, you need to take a more objective view of your research and make sure that they realise when bad news is happening. So as well as the obvious area to do with making sure you do good experimental design, we've got these other areas of bias as well. Bias that you introduce, bias that the participant is not being heard properly, and the third area of bias is to do with the way we feed back to the development team. I hope you found that useful. If you did, please give the video a thumbs up, and if you have any questions, please post them below and I'll get around to them.